Good afternoon. I'm Serge Belanger, the Spec Pharma analyst at Needham, and we're happy to have with us this afternoon Vincent Nitto from Aerie Pharmaceuticals. I think one of the more exciting emerging ophthalmology company. They launched a product last year, and they're getting ready to launch their second one. So I'll let Vince introduce himself and maybe provide a quick update, and then we'll dive into some questions.
Sure. I'm Vince Nitto. I'm the Chair and CEO of Aerie. I've been that since 2013 when we took the company public. At the time that we went public, again, just 6 years ago, we had phase 2 data on Rhopressa, and that product is the one that's already on the market. It's been on the market for just shy of a year. And the second one called Rocklatan, which is our combination of Rhopressa with latanoprost. At the time we went public, all we had was animal data. And so here we are just 6 years later with that product about ready for launch. And so as you can imagine, the company is having, it's an exciting time, and it's very, very busy. And we expect that 2 major events coming up. Number one, the Rocklatan launch will be later on over the next couple of weeks. So as early as 2 weeks from now, we'll have product in the wholesalers and start sampling, et cetera. So that'll be a great first move for us. And second of all, on Rhopressa, we're going to be moving our Medicare Part D coverage from around 40% up to about 70 or 75% Medicare Part D coverage. So again, May will be a pretty busy month for us, and it'll be an exciting one for the sales force.
Yeah. So I guess let's start off with Rhopressa. It's been on the market now for coming on up to close to a year, in May. What has been some of the surprises? How is it tracking? I know you've previously launched products at your old company. Some of the different changes you've seen from launching products back then to what you've seen now and currently.
So we saw 2 major changes, say over the last 5 years or so from our last company to launching this particular product. And the 2 are the following. Number one, not only the degree of managed care coverage and the impact that has on day-to-day practice of physicians, but more importantly within ophthalmology, because we were one of the last groups of all of the physician groups to actually get impacted by managed care, because the market itself is so small. So it took them a while to get there, but once they got there, the impact that they've had on the day-to-day practice patterns of the doctor is pretty incredible. Time and time again, we basically see doctors throwing their hands up and basically saying, we're just not going to fight it. We'll just do whatever managed care tells us to do. So the influence has become critical, and that's why one of the decisions we made pretty early on was try to get our products not only covered, but covered as tier 2. And the reason for that is simply because the patient's copay come down to about $20 to $40 or so. We know that at that level, about 70 or 75% of the prescriptions actually get picked up. So we're not losing prescriptions because the copays are too high. And so we thought that we needed to do that to handle that influence. And then second of all, because this isn't our first sales force that we've ever built, it was interesting to see the dynamics and the changes. We had something like 5,000 resume per 100 sales positions. So we had a huge number of folks that wanted to come work for a startup and launch what we thought was going to be a pretty significant addition to the glaucoma market. And so we had pretty much our pick. And so because of our backgrounds all in ophthalmology, we decided that we were going to go after those folks who had the physician relationships and had been in ophthalmology for quite a while. What was interesting to note is that because so few products have been approved and launched within glaucoma over the last decade or more, very few of the folks who had extensive ophthalmology experience had launch experience. And so what we found about 6 months into the launch was that we needed to make a change in our sales force and the profile to which we were hiring. And so we ended up bringing it down to launch experience became the number 1 job that we had. And so as we looked at the new profile of reps that we brought in to replace the roughly 15 or 20 that we displaced, those have more launch experience, and some of them have no ophthalmology experience. In fact, if I look at our top 10 sales territories today, about half of them have no prior ophthalmology experience before joining Aerie. And so we're very excited about the changes we've made and the prospects we have for both of our products.
Great. So can you talk about maybe some anecdotal feedback on the product's efficacy and safety and what you've seen so far? And I guess I know you initially launched it as an adjunctive treatment, or you see it being used adjunctively, or you see it wider use than what you were initially thinking of?
We think that the product experience for Rhopressa since launch has been very positive for us. We think that the doctors have been very, very surprised with its efficacy. They typically add it as a third or fourth line, so to max medical therapy, and they just try to give it a shot. These are patients that, if nothing else works, they're having to go to surgery, and this is end-stage surgery for them. So the physicians are trying to do everything possible to keep them from doing that. And so what we've seen is, and even in those settings, we're still getting some pretty good pressure drops. Not in every patient. There's clearly a number of patients that are just too far along and just don't respond, but enough patients to where it's captured the physician's imaginations. And so they've started moving it up into their armamentarium. So we do see principally adjunctive use. We see only about maybe 5% or 10% of the patients who are only on Rhopressa, so it's a pretty small number. Almost all of them are at least on a prostaglandin, and many times it's a prostaglandin plus something else, and then they're adding Rhopressa to that. And so from that perspective, it's not a particular surprise. On the managed care side, again, realizing its pretty big influence, after 1 year from launch, we'll be covered on 75% or so of the Medicare Part D plans, and so that's critical to our success. So to be able to do that and to get it down to Tier 2 all within 1 year is a pretty good success rate for us. On the commercial side, it's no major surprise. We got to about 80% or so after a couple of months, and we're sitting at about 90-95% commercial coverage already. So again, anything that we can do to help the physicians write for the product, we will.
Okay. And for those lucky enough to track weekly prescriptions every Friday, should we expect a big growth inflection when formulary coverage expands in the next couple months?
The last time that we had a 30% increase in the number of patients, the number of lives covered, was back in October of last year. We went from about 10 or 12% coverage to just over 40%, so about 42% or so. A month later, we saw a 23% increase in prescriptions. And so we think that as soon as we're able to communicate to the physicians that are impacted by those plans that the drug's going to be covered, they start giving samples out to those patients, and so a month later we see those patients coming back or filling the prescriptions for the first time. So we do expect to see an inflection point. What'll be interesting to watch, though, is that that's smack in the middle of when we're going to be launching Rocklatan as well. So it'd be interesting to see sort of what the dynamics are in the marketplace, which, again, that's one of the reasons why we're not providing guidance by product. We are simply providing guidance for total revenues.
Okay. So I guess good segue into Rocklatan. How have the launch preparations gone? And clearly we're almost 2-3 weeks away. Just where are you in terms of why was there a delay between the approval and early May launch? And I guess can you talk about who you think you'll be able to target in terms of patient population?
So from a preparation point of view, we actually started prepping for the launch back last year, as you can imagine. So we've been doing an awful lot of work out in the marketplace. We had an awful lot of data that we were able to share with physicians and the like, and so there's been a lot of presentations, posters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we started training the sales force right around the Thanksgiving timeframe. We wanted to make sure that not only those that were still with us at that time, but also the new sales force was fully trained on Rocklatan long before we had approval. And the reason for that is we fully expected or hoped, more than expected, that the FDA would actually give us a quick approval. And so as we looked out towards the end of the year, it didn't come, but we still needed to do launch prep. So we spent several $1 million last year on the commercial side for advertising promotional programs to get ready in case we got an early approval. And then unfortunately for us, they shut the government down. And so while we did get an early approval by a few days, We fully expected that we would have gotten about a month or two earlier. We would have been done because we knew that the questions were pretty well taken care of. There wasn't too many issues that were left. And so, again, we had to do an awful lot of prep, but we felt pretty good about our launch preparation at that point. Our sales force then went to a national sales meeting where they did the final training. We did that as we did our fourth quarter earnings call. And so that was only about a month and a half or so ago. And so they were fully trained at this point. From a launch preparation point of view, we continued. We went from being able to announce the approval of the product when we were at another investment conference, and we went directly from that investment conference to the American Glaucoma Society meeting. And so literally 2 days after we got the approval letter, we were able to start talking to the physicians about Rocklatan, the data that we saw there, and start talking to them about the prospects for how they're going to use Rocklatan versus Rhopressa. And what was interesting is because in that data set, not only do we have great results about Rocklatan, but we also had new data about how Rhopressa did relative to Rocklatan and relative to latanoprost. And what we found in that clinical trial was Rhopressa actually did better in those phase 3 trials, in the Rocklatan phase 3 trials, than it did on its own because we were comparing it against only once-a-day products. Whereas in its own trials, we had to compare it to a twice-a-day Timolol. So there's always a little bit of a bias there when you're comparing a once-a-day product and you're having to force feed a second bottle in there to be able to compare it to what we consider to be the gold standard for those trials. So we've got, again, great data now on Rocklatan and for Rhopressa. The interesting component as we share this data with the physicians at the American Glaucoma Society meeting is watching them sit back and absorb the data and begin to realize how it was going to impact their practice. And the thing that was amazing, or most amazing, was the fact that they started describing what was going on in their minds as every time, given the data, every time that I see a patient walking in the door, instead of thinking about where's their pressure, do I need to add another drug, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they're now thinking about, as soon as that patient walks in the door, regardless of what they're on, why am I not putting that patient on Rocklatan? Because it's one eye drop. They look at the efficacy data, they look at the responder analysis, and realize how low those pressures are getting. We had 2/3 of the patients getting down to 16 millimeters and below. Starting points are up in the mid-20s. They don't see too many results like that. We had 1/3 of the patients getting down to 14 millimeters and below. You only see those kind of pressure drops after surgery. And so as a result, these guys are not thinking about, well, Rocklatan's going to be this niche here or this niche there. They're basically saying every patient walking through that door is someone that maybe I should be thinking about putting on a once-a-day drop that gives me those kind of pressure drops. Okay. So it's a big fundamental change in the way they think.
So as you think of the ramp up for Rocklatan, should we expect something similar to what we saw with Rhopressa? And same thing with the formulary coverage of how it expanded with Rhopressa. Should we see the same cadence?
So we would encourage everybody to think about the same cadence for managed care coverage that we had with Rhopressa because that's the conservative approach. Mm-hmm. And that cadence was as follows. It was about 10 or 12% after a couple of months. It jumped up to a little over 40% after 6 months. And now a year later, we're going to be about 75%. I can give you all the reasons as to why I think that's going to accelerate with Rocklatan, not the least of which we're already on the majority of these managed care contracts, so we already have the contracts in place. Adding Rhopressa, simply sticking another couple of pages at the end of the contract and just putting an addendum for the rebates that we're going to be providing. So it's as easy as that. Remember, managed care is 2 parts. You've got the contracting side, which I just talked about. You also have the medical side. And so most of those folks have already seen data on Rocklatan. So as we were presenting Rhopressa to many of these managed care plans, they asked us for Rocklatan data as part of that presentation. And we had our medical affairs people are able to provide that kind of information. So what we're seeing now as we go back in to talk to these guys specifically about Rocklatan they're basically, some of them are coming back saying, well, we can start the contract side because the medical guys have already said you don't need to go through a full medical review. Now, not everybody's doing that. Some of them are still calling us in saying you have to go through the whole medical review, and so we're prepared to do that. But we, again, we see enough of those to think, oh, we have a shot at accelerating this thing. So I think from that perspective, it can go pretty well. I think in the marketplace, it's all going to be driven by coverage, and it's all going to be driven by who controls what within any one piece of geography. And so we see situations like here in New York where a good doctor or a doctor up in the Upper East Side that we know pretty well, he's switching every patient that he can, not just those Repressa patients, but every patient he can, to Rocklatan, because those guys don't care about whatever copays they're going to have to pay. I have another guy down in Chinatown who won't write Rocklatan until it's covered. So he's going to stick to Repressa for the next 12 months or so, or however long it takes us to get it on the plans that are most important to them. And I think that's what's going to happen around the country. We try to make pricing to managed cares a no-brainer for them so that they can put both on and do this pretty quickly. But in case it does follow the same cadence, you'll see across the country this thing playing out to where you'll be able to tell, or we'll be able to tell where we have coverage or not based on whether they're writing Repressa or Rocklatan. Okay. And so I think that's going to impact the ability for Rocklatan to take hold. But again, that mental shift could say, once we get those plans taken care of, we could see a much greater uptake for Rocklatan much faster than we ever could have hoped for Repressa.
Okay. And I guess, so Repressa was competing in the adjunctive treatments against older products administered 2 or 3 times daily. Rocklatan will have more of a frontline role, where some of the prostaglandins are also administered once daily and are generic. So how do you convince somebody is doing on efficacy or safety, or I guess where's your messaging?
Well, from a pricing point of view, we try to make the difference between Repressa and Rocklatan to be basically the cost of a latanoprost generic prescription. It's only about $10, all in after everything's done. And so we try to make it agnostic so that the managed care plan doesn't really care one way or another. They just put both of them on. So that'll facilitate. So that means everything will be about the efficacy side. The fact, again, that is capturing everybody's imagination is the ability to get the patients down to lower pressures than they've been able to before with one single eye drop. And if they can do that, then they're going to switch not only some prostaglandin patients over, but they're going to be looking at every patient that comes through the door as to why not Rocklatan for them. Okay.
And one of the big questions we get from investors is the amount of cannibalization of Repressa from Rocklatan. How do you think about that? And should we even think about it as soon as Rocklatan launches? Will that have an impact on second quarter volumes? And then obviously in the future when Rocklatan gets more traction, how do you see it impacting Repressa sales?
So the easier way to me to explain this is to talk a little bit about where I think Repressa is going to be used, and then the balance is going to be all Rocklatan. So I think the Repressa is going to be used by those doctors who truly believe that either Lumigan or Travatan, which are the other 2 large prostaglandins that are currently available that are still branded. So if they're big believers in one of those 2, they may not want to switch off to a latanoprost. Even though most people think all the prostaglandins are the same. They're using one of those for a reason. And so we think the Repressa is going to be the likely adjunctive choice to a patient or a doctor who's using branded prostaglandins like Lumigan or Travatan. It's also going to be perhaps the drug of choice for those patients and for those doctors where they decided that the patient either can't tolerate or doesn't want the permanent cosmetic changes caused by the prostaglandins. And so that's another market. And then, a large piece of the market, too, is patients who still need the pressure drop, but their starting pressures are so low that some of these other medications like Timolol or the prostaglandins are not particularly effective. These are patients where you still need a pressure drop, but these patients' starting pressures in the low 20s or so. And so those kind of patients were, we've been able to show, especially, for example, we just completed a PRO study on Japanese and Japanese Americans where their starting pressures were in a 17, 18 millimeter range, and we were able to get those patients down to 11 and 12 millimeters of mercury. And so, again, you don't see those kind of pressure drops with either prostaglandins or beta blockers. And so I think those are the three segments. That could be a third or more of the market. So, but the balance is open for Rocklatan. And so that's why we think there's about a 3x delta in terms of potential between Rhopressa and Rocklatan.
Okay. I think in the past, maybe one of your analyst days, you had previously talked about reaching a combined market share of 30 to 40% in terms of peak market share. A year into the launch of the first product, how do you feel about that goal? Do you think it's still attainable, and are you on the way there?
We think so. I think the fact that we were able to get 75% Medicare Part D coverage after a year bodes pretty well, because Rocklatan certainly won't be any slower than that. It could end up being faster. So, as we close out this calendar year, if we can get a little bit of acceleration on Medicare Part D coverage for Rocklatan, then we should start seeing the true potential for both of those products. And so, assuming that, and we feel confident with the revenue guidance that we provided for this year at 110 to 120 million range, which basically bracketed was consensus was for the calendar year, we think that bodes pretty well, again, given that we get the coverage we're looking for to be able to generate the kind of revenues we're talking about. The surprise, as I mentioned, was the change in the physician's attitude when we actually showed them the Rocklatan data. And so if in fact that plays out once we go live, and then we could see Rocklatan taking off incredibly fast. And so that's why getting that coverage becomes so important.
Okay. And in terms of competition or future competition, I think when you launched Rhopressa, there was talk of Vyzulta also launched around the same time. I think it's been a limited factor. Is there anything else in the pipeline that you find interesting or you think could be a future competitor to either Rhopressa or Rocklatan?
The only new glaucoma agents that we've seen from a therapeutics point of view are a couple of them that we see occurring in Japan, and both of them are prostaglandin-like. And so what's interesting is their efficacy rates are not particularly different than the prostaglandins, and in fact may not be as good as that. And so there's no current indication that those Japanese companies are thinking about bringing those products into the U.S. market because of that. And so we haven't seen any of those. Certainly there's an awful lot of drug delivery companies out there that have got prostaglandins or some other drugs that they're putting in there with the hopes of improving compliance. And so we'll see many of those can't show better efficacy than the equivalent product in an eye drop. So we'll see how that plays out as well. But right now we just don't see any new therapeutics coming into the market that could supplant either Rhopressa or Rocklatan.
Okay. Moving on to ex-US commercialization strategy. I think as a company, you've taken the somewhat unusual route of funding the development on your own. Can you just give us an update on where you are and what we can expect, I guess, for 2019?
Sure. So we'll start off with Europe. In Europe, we decided that we were going to commercialize ourselves in addition to developing ourselves. And the good news is that we expect to have approval for Rhopressa before the end of this calendar year. The minute that we get that approval, we will go ahead and submit for Rocklatan in Europe. The European market is very much a combination market. It's not a single entity market, because we did all of our studies comparing Rhopressa to Timolol here in the U.S., and that's what we use for the basis for approval there. That's what they'll use for the basis of pricing. So we definitely don't want to be priced as a generic Timolol. And so that's why we want to get Rocklatan done and approved over in Europe. We're conducting a phase 3 trial, not for regulatory reasons, but for pricing reasons in Europe. We're comparing Rocklatan to Ganforth, which is one of the better and highest priced combinations of prostaglandin plus Timolol in Europe. And we're doing, the typical study is a non-inferiority. If you hit that in Europe, you're allowed then to test for superiority. And so if we're able to achieve that, then the bet is that we'll get a higher price than they did. And then once we get Rocklatan approved and priced, then we'll come back and launch Rhopressa into the market. But we'll use Rhopressa for the next 12 to 18 months while we're waiting for approval and pricing of Rocklatan to basically help doctors get experience with a Rho kinase inhibitor.
Okay.
And then in Japan, and then by the way, commercialization, we'll go after the 5 major markets, assuming we get pricing at all of them at the same time. The sales force size is only about 75 people, so roughly a cost of about 25 to 30 million. And so we think that based on the potential for Rocklatan in Europe and the fact that our Irish facility comes online before the end of this calendar year, so we start shipping product out of there either at the end of the year or beginning of next year. Our cost of goods, certainly as we supply some of the U.S. as well as Europe, is going to come down to by around 40%. So we'll have plenty of margin with which to play. In Japan, we conducted, as I said, the probe study on Japanese and Japanese American patients, which showed we can expect pretty good efficacy on Japanese eyes, which is great. We started our phase 2 trials in Japan here about a month or so ago, 25 to 30 sites in the country. We'll have roughly a couple hundred patients, and we'll have all of those enrolled and maybe get a shot at reading data out before the end of the calendar year, if not at the beginning of next year. Then we'll move right into phase 3 trials after that. We haven't made a decision about not finding a partner. So, we're still committed to finding a commercial partner in Japan. It's kind of an interesting situation. The top 3 companies that we know very, very well over there, they could do a great job, all have either pipelines or products already in the market for glaucoma. So the question is, do we give ours up, knowing that we're walking into a situation where they've got their own product that could be competitive, or do we just go to the next tier down of companies and put one of them into the game? Or ultimately, we can always rent a sales force over there and do it ourselves if we choose to. We'll have enough time to establish the Aerie name over there, and if we decide that we've gotten to the point where it makes sense, then that's always an option. But I think the null hypothesis is we'll find a partner.
Okay. And how should we think about the market size relative to the U.S. size for both Europe and Japan? Obviously, there's differences in pricing and volumes, but...
So the European pricing is relatively low. So here in the U.S., we're talking about $100 or so a month. There you're talking about maybe $20 a month or so. But they sell 50% more units, and so that offsets that to some degree. But again, you're looking at a dollar market that's roughly maybe a little bit more than half of the U.S., maybe a couple of billion instead of our $3+ billion. In Japan, it's about $1 billion market, and the nice thing is that you do get premium price for innovative products, which we will have, and so we'll enjoy that price for roughly about a 5 or 6 year period. So again, we think that the prospects are there for. Certainly in Europe, we think Rocklatan has a shot at being $100 million plus, which would make it a big deal in the European market on a revenue point of view. And in Japan, we think Rhopressa, because of its activity on lower pressure patients, could actually get up into the $100 million plus category. So we're excited about, again, for different reasons, our franchise in both of those areas.
Okay. And then just to touch upon the Ireland plant, I think you mentioned it could come online as soon as late this year, maybe?
Right.
And I guess what additional steps need to be taken there, and what impact do you envision on, I guess, your margins and the product margins going forward once that plant comes online?
So the great news for us is we finished our 3 validation batches already in that Irish facility. So we're just now waiting for the last bit of testing that needs to be done. It'll happen here in the next week or 2. We haven't seen anything yet in the results that give us any pause or anything like that, so we're assuming that those are going to be okay. So the next major step is for the Irish authorities to go in and do the final inspection. We'll be in the process of getting that ready. And then we fully expect that the FDA will want to take a look. If you take a look at the FDA guidance for the CMC now, very seldom do they allow a plant to go live without them, especially offshore, without them showing up. And so we do expect that they'll be in a position to do something like that, before the end of the calendar year. And so the product that we have made will have enough time from a stability point of view where we can start supplying some of the U.S. needs. We don't ever expect to get rid of our contract manufacturers. They've been great partners. We'll continue to use them on a going forward basis, but certainly we'll see some margin impact by us moving some of the demand, especially on Rocklatan, to the Irish facility. And then certainly as we think about Europe and Japan, we'll feed those markets via the Irish facility. What most folks don't realize is the Irish have better tax treaties with Japan than the U.S. does. And so we could actually hire people in Japan through our Irish sub and pick up credits and all sorts of different things that we can ship product over there at much, much favorable rates than we could if we had the plant here in the U.S.
Huh. Along with the president.
Hey, listen, Rich tells me he planned it, but I'm pretty sure he didn't know that till after the fact.
I guess moving on to the pipeline is the last few minutes here. I guess before that, I think in the past you've talked about the role of Rhopressa, Rocklatan in normal tensive eyes. Any plans to run trials for, I don't know if it would be a label expansion or just for additional use in those eyes?
I don't think that the situation in the U.S. from a regulatory point of view opens itself up to us being able to do norm-intensive studies here in the U.S. They view glaucoma and ocular hypertension for what it is, and they're saying, look, we don't tell you what IOP ranges to study, so giving you a special label for norm-intensive patients doesn't make any sense at all. If you have data and you can follow the rules, you can share that data because you're still dropping pressure.
Okay.
Right? So the norm-intensive studies that we'll be doing will be basically the Japanese studies. We're going to be looking at pressures as low as around 12 millimeters of mercury, I think, at the lower end. And so, and again, we expect the average pressure for the patients over there to be somewhere around untreated pressures of maybe 17 or so. So if we get the kind of data that we have gotten already on our probe study, start seeing those pressures drop down to 11 or 12, we can use that as norm-intensive.
Okay. Wanted to see if there's any questions before we talk about the pipeline. Otherwise, you have 2 minutes.
Okay. So from a pipeline point of view, we're pretty excited. About a year or so ago, we ended up making an acquisition of a small company called Envisia, provided us with some manufacturing technology where you can make these small inserts and actually use those to inject either in front or back of the eye. We were able to get the first one out into the clinic just about a month or so ago. It's a dexamethasone insert for the treatment of retinal vein occlusion and diabetic macular edema. So that study has already begun enrolling. We actually injected a couple of patients already, and we expect that we'll have some safety and some efficacy data before the end of the calendar year. Here in about a month or so, again, using the same idea, looking at a small insert, we put in a Rho kinase protein kinase C inhibitor that will be used for the treatment of wet AMD. Totally independent pathway of VEGF inhibition, and so we have some great animal data that gives us an awful lot of hope for that product. That'll be going into the clinic here in about a month or so. But we won't see a data readout there until the beginning of next year. So again, very excited about the prospects for that technology as it relates to both front and back of the eye conditions. And we actually just completed, not too long ago, a CGMP facility to make those inserts in our corporate headquarters in Durham.
Okay.
So we're excited about that.
Great. And obviously you have a couple of pipeline assets. Any plans to be more active in business development and maybe add a later stage asset to continue your cadence of launching a product on an annual basis?
Well, I don't know about launching products on an annual basis. I'm not committing to that, but certainly we think that we've got a lot of interest, obviously, in glaucoma where we are today, in the retinal diseases. We continue looking at other things that we can add to the pipeline there. The other two areas that we have a particular interest in is dry eye. We think there's about 9 companies that are reporting data from last year, December, to the middle of this coming year, and so we think that maybe doing a license or an acquisition of some of those companies would make an awful lot of sense for us. And because of the market conditions in the United States especially, we think chasing some of the technologies, and we can use our own technology as well for presbyopia. to get rid of your reading glasses. And so there are a number of companies that are using repurposed drugs in combinations. Put an eye drop in, and you can actually see the menu that night for a couple hours. And we think that using our print technology, we found a class of drugs that we could actually inject into the back of the eye and have an injection last about a year or so that'll do the same thing, i.e. change the dynamics in the eye, so you can actually, if you haven't been able to read a menu without reading glasses for a while, we may be able to take care of that with one injection. It's not for every patient, but the market's pretty immense, and it's a lifestyle difference for some patients.
All right, well, I think our time's up. Thanks for answering all my questions.
Not a problem. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.